Hello, welcome back to my fave fanfics. Here, I post, well, my favorite fanfictions, if that wasn't obvious. I do hope you'll enjoy them as much as I do. Please like and subscribe for more content. Without further ado, let's get started.
Welcome, my dear faves. This is part 11 of What If Ichigo Lost His Zanpakuto in the World of One Piece. Credit goes to unseated 4th. Chapter 32. Not 25 years. Nothing ever went as he planned. Khan groaned as yet another obnoxious and jaunty tune echoed throughout the Kid Pirates' ship. Given it was their ship, it was fair enough that they could play whatever music they wanted, but Khan could only stand so much of it. If his plans had been successful, he and the electric freak would have been long out of here by now. But of course, things hadn't gone as he'd wanted. Wire owned too much annoying music, and seemed to never grow bored of playing the same songs over and over each day. If any of the other crew members found it annoying, it certainly didn't show. If anything, they seemed to like the noise. Kid himself was trying to sing along, but he sucked. Wire wasn't too bad, but was annoying nonetheless. At least they'd made progress in other areas, as sparse as it had been. Heat had announced having spotted Khan in the paper a few days earlier. Of course it had turned out to be Ichigo, pulling yet another stunt that would undoubtedly bring more trouble to no one but Khan. Boy would Ichigo get his ass kicked once all this was over. The newspaper article had detailed Ichigo and company's exploits at another island, giving them some indication as to where their target was, thus what actions should be made next. As though sensing his thoughts, Grimjow came and stood beside him. "We can't stay with these guys for much longer," he said. "From what I can tell, they'll be going a separate way to what Ichigo is headed soon. Going back to one of their hideouts or something." Khan nodded, agreeing with the Arrancar for once. "They've gotten us this far. It's time to part ways. We'll go our own way at the next island." In a small and stuffy room out the back of his shop, Urahara rummaged. Just the other day he'd been contacted by the Soul Society, informing him of recent developments in the troublesome plight. Whatever young Kurosaki had involved himself in would have to wait. There were far more pressing matters right now. Mayuri Kuritsuchi was getting the same results as he was. There was no doubt about it now. Reminding himself that 25 years on this side had by no means been 25 years on the other side, especially given the role of the Dongai in the matter, he realized that it was no longer a matter of if their actions had not been as permanent as hoped, but rather when those actions would be undone, and that would be soon. And as always, it would be his job to intervene. The halls were quiet. Quieter than usual. Wishram left his quarters and headed out into the main hall, barely a whisper passing the air as he went. Adlivin was always quiet during a full moon. Shearwater had closed himself away as he usually did at this time, Potoro being the only one allowed to visit. He needed this time to gather that energy of his, and as he was anticipating Kurosaki sometime soon, he'd been needing as much as he could muster. Wishram glanced over toward Adlivin's epicenter. There was a disturbance towards the central chamber, a shifting in the ice. It was only a small matter of time, 2 weeks maybe, before Shearwater's plan was able to be fully realized, before his powers would envelope Zangetsu entirely and become supreme, before his secret weapon was awakened. And somehow, it was a disturbing thought. Right now, the falling snow was thicker than the mist. And while that in itself wasn't overly problematic, there were currently other issues to be concerned with. Namely the fact that while passing through a recent misty spot, Usopp had managed to get himself lost. Zoro narrowed his eyes through the thickening fall of snow and ash. Wasn't getting lost his thing? Not he'd admit to being one who got lost, of course. He and Chopper were searching now. The sniper was out there, Zoro could feel it. The fog was easy to become disoriented in. From what he could tell, there were none of those creatures close by. Not that it was easy to tell at all, as he had learned in the past, but there was no knowing when they, or worse, would show themselves. He can't have gone too far, Chopper voiced, sniffing at the surrounding snow in his walk point. Zoro knew that the reindeer's sense of smell was likely greatly diminished by the consistency of snow and ash. The added presence of mist only added to reduce their visibility. The darkness of the nightscape probably wasn't helping either. Zoro was getting really sick of this island. Yes, but if we don't find him soon, he might, he responded. We better be quick then. The reindeer frantically pointed out the obvious, before a sudden jarring in the earth halted him where he stood. This again? Zoro muttered to himself. Tremors had not been uncommon since arriving on this island. But soon it became clear that this tremor was different to the others, in a way Zoro could not describe. It was more pronounced, perhaps they were closer to the epicenter. In a sudden lurch, the ground beneath them trembled and shifted all the more. Zoro focused, his mind a slowly clearing fog as he discerned the cause of the new earthquake. There is something down there, something embedded in the depths of Erebus soil. Something was stirring, something alive. That was all he could tell. At once, the tremor stopped. At a guess, it had lasted half a minute. Maybe longer. Usopp was much further off now. The idiot had wandered too far, and probably run once the ground had started shaking. He was very fast when he thought he needed to be. But as Zoro harnessed his senses, something else became more apparent, someone else was even closer. He couldn't tell who it was from here, but knew that it could only be one of their nakama. Running up along the slope of the mountain, Zoro gained speed, already unsheathing his swords as he went. Taken by surprise, Chopper galloped after him. Why are you running in this direction suddenly? He called after him, if you just run off like this, you'll get lost. Quote. As if we're not already. He shot back. But why now? Where are you going? Quote. Just trust me on this, Zoro responded without looking back. Sanji remained standing, his final cigarette having long since burned to ash. Not that it mattered anymore, there were more pressing issues to tend to right here and now. He was glad he'd sent Nami to safer ground when he did. Since then, stronger monsters had come along. Don't think. Just fight. No matter how many he took down, even more would file in to take their place. While he was confident in his own strength, Sanji wondered how much longer he could keep it up for. If there were just a way to get out of here, but it was too late for that. He'd have to see this though to the end, one way or another. A particularly large shrieker launched at him, Ma Agape as it made for his side. Sanji had enough time to boot his knee up, connecting it with the shrieker's jaw before another swiped for his shoulder. He took them down. One after another. It didn't matter how many they were, he'd fight them for as long as he could remain standing and then some. Is that all you've got? He shouted at them. He'd faced far worse horrors in his life and endured them through to the end. This would be no different. Diabol Hambi. He muttered, his leg igniting as he launched his next attack. Many of the remaining shriekers hissed as the flame came too close for comfort, even hitting some of them and sending them flying off the cliff's edge. Sanji winced as his side throbbed painfully, energy sapping from his leg and hip where the tranquilizing pellets had struck him. He staggered for a moment, standing firmly despite the burning in his ankle, not from the flames of Diablo Hambi, but from the reality that his ankle may have been very firmly twisted, and faced his opponents. He laughed despite it all. "You don't like that, do you?" He questioned them, his leg ablaze and threatening. He was losing his balance, his fatigue impacting his stance. As the Shrieker's numbers gradually weakened, so did he. He couldn't die here. Not when there were still Nakama out there who needed him, not when there was still an All Blue out there, waiting. He took the spare moment to look around. What was this? He could actually see an end to them? Exclamation mark. They were growing stronger, but so long as he knew they were finite, there was hope. But as he went about taking down what remained of the predators, a new danger emerged. A dense mist wafted in front of him, and Sanji barely leapt aside as a specter materialized. He wasn't fast enough. Its scythe-like limbs cut deep beside his shoulder and he tasted bile as his blood stung the white snow. Damn it. This was problematic. The specters were on a whole other level. If he simply kicked out at them, his leg would pass right through like a wisp of air. The only effective method for slowing them down was to use Haki or Diablo Hambi, which took more energy than he was willing to expend. Dodging them was his best chance for now, though even he was slowing down. Mustering what remained of his strength, Sanji's leg ignited once more and he kicked out at the newly arrived entity, causing it to reel back. A few moments passed and the specter seemed to disintegrate, put off by the fire. But it had done its damage. Sanji raised a shaking hand to his shoulder, immediately feeling the smear of warm blood. But he wasn't quite alone yet. Another shrieker made for him and he kicked down hard, an audible crack sounding from its skull. Just as this happened, however, another launched at him from behind, and Sanji didn't even manage to turn around against the weight of his impending exhaustion as it dragged him to his knees. There would not be enough time to react, even for him. This was it, this was as far as he could go. There was a sickening slash as the shrieker was sliced apart. Unable to express his surprise, Sanji squinted through the mist of his dimming vision, searching for what could have come to his aid. Beside him, another shrieker had launched itself toward him, but was incapacitated before it could reach its target. "Getting your ass kicked, hey shitty cook?" A voice spoke from nearby. A pang of annoyance mixed with some form of gladness filled Sanji's senses as the familiar form of the swordsman faded into his view. With the flick of a sword, Zoro illuminated the few remaining shriekers. "Since you're here, I guess the ship is nearby?" Quote. "We're on a mountain," Sanji responded flatly, staggering to his feet. Zoro looked him up and down, taking in the obvious injuries, as well as the multitude of bodies around them. "Sure like putting your life on the line, don't you?" Quote. "You're one to talk," Sanji retorted. His mind buzzed, and he barely noticed his legs give out beneath him. "Oi," Zoro's voice sounded, a strong arm securing him by the shoulders, snap out of it. Sanji tried to stand on his own. He couldn't die here, especially not in the company of this shithead. "Nami-san," he remembered, "Nami is out there, down the mountain. We need to find her." "Unfortunately you come first right now, moron," Zoro said, before turning and shouting back the way he'd come. "Chopper. Get over here." He then turned back to Sanji. You'll be back to your shitty, annoying self soon. Bastard. The hurried sound of the doctor's footsteps came padding over the snow, leaping over the bodies of shriekers as it drew closer. Chopper's voice sounded distant as it directed orders at Zoro, who followed them unquestioningly. Sanji knew he couldn't rest until he knew Nami was safe. He struggled against the other two, although he knew it would be hopeless. But Nami. We'll find her, Zoro assured. We'll find all of them, those lost idiots. Giving in to his drowsiness, Sanji let them tend to him. Even if he tried, there was no way he'd be dying here and now. Nami ran, the powdery snow flicking up behind her as she went. The ride down the mountain in the cart had felt like an eternity. When it finally reached the mountain's base, she had climbed out and landed clumsily in the soft snow below. Getting to her feet immediately, she'd taken a defensive stance, wielding the Climatact and ready to fight off whatever came for her. But there was nothing. Because they're all up the mountain, she'd thought to herself. It probably wasn't far from the truth at all. On the cable cart down the mountain, she'd seen where the seemingly endless torrent of the creatures had been coming from. At the base of the cliff they'd been atop was a large crevice illuminated by the moonlight from within the mountain. The shriekers were spilling out of it like a wildfire. There must have been a den or nest of some sort in there. And Sanji, that idiot. Why did he have to be so chivalrous to the point his life was well and truly over the line? Nami knew that had she stayed there it would not have made much difference, but Sanji's actions angered her nonetheless, prompting her to run faster. After a few minutes, she slowed down. She put her hand to the trunk of a tree for support as she bent over, panting. Running so fast without reason had probably been a dumb decision. She needed to conserve her energy after all. Sitting with her back against the tree, she took a few moments to catch her breath. Her eyes were bleary and stung from running in the cold, and thirst tingled at her senses. But against her immediate discomforts, a light shone in the distance. Nami squinted and stood, sticking to the shadows of the forest as she moved closer. Within moments, the object of her wonder became apparent, and she hurriedly pushed her back to a wide tree, its expanse blocking her from anything that may have been occupying the circle of light. After taking a few moments to gather the necessary courage, Nami peeked out from behind her shelter, eyes narrowed. A civilization, what was left of one, bare as it was, glimmered before her in the firelight. A crescent-shaped crevice must have surrounded much of the area, thus contributing the luminous glow. She couldn't see much of what was there from this perspective, so she chose to slowly approach. Keeping to the shadows, she squinted her eyes into the light, trying to make out what she could. A circle of old, crumbling houses from the island's lighter ages surrounded a fairly large crack in the earth, from which the flames were coming. Evidentially, it was once a small community. But now it had different occupants to what it must originally have had. Shriekers lurked in the shadows and calluses, growling lowly amongst themselves. Some were stationed around the edge of the settlement, pacing. Were they expecting an attack of some sort? Because Nami certainly wasn't about to resort to that. It would be suicide. Others were scattered about the small village circle, slowly going about their business. From this perspective, they seemed kind of sentient. Calm and non-hostile amongst themselves. Nami widened her gaze to encompass the entire clearing. Wherever it was, they were looked to have once been some sort of town center. There had to be some sort of useful resource she could find here. Too bad the place was overrun. If she could just get in there, she could find something of use, a map, perhaps, not that she could imagine the creatures using such things. Something to indicate her location on the island at any rate, something she could use to help locate her nakama. She pressed her back firmer against the tree as she heard a couple of stray growls from one of the town center's occupants. Glancing down to her Climatact, now strapped into its holster, she gained an idea. The invisibility function of her Mirage Tempo had worked well in getting them out of trouble at Atlantica. It was a perfect means of sneaking in and out quickly and undetected. Nami gulped. Even so, she'd have to be desperate to enter a camp full of them. But she was desperate. It was decided. Sanji's sacrifice wouldn't be for nothing. If she could find a way into the camp, perhaps she could discover some helpful resources. Once she had a plan of action she was confident with, she was going in. This was not the sort of place Ichigo wanted to be in alone and unarmed. The fact that he and Luffy had managed to become separated like this after sticking together was more than just annoying and careless on his part. If Rukia were here, she would tell him off for this. Renji would as well, and probably give him a good thump on the head. Rukia would probably do that too, actually. They both would. He missed them. Currently, he was somewhere on the slopes of Dusumet. That was all he knew, he was totally lost. The night hadn't budged, but it was at least light enough out for him to see where he was going. And since being separated from Luffy, he hadn't encountered anything. Who had that guy been though? He had seemed almost like a being he would come across in the Soul Society or Hueco Mundo than anywhere else. But it was different again. "You are walking a dangerous path," he had said. No shit. A sound echoed from down within the mountain and Ichigo's hand twitched to grab the hilt of a sword that wasn't there. He slowed his pace as he crept along a ridge, the slope of the mountain steep beside him. Eventually, the pathway widened at a large entryway to the mountain. Ichigo took a moment to take it all in. It wasn't a cave or cavern as he'd already seen. This was obviously man-made. The entryway was framed and held in place by a set of impressive pillars carved out of stone, and the immediate interior looked as though it once been decorated with more intricate carvings, most of which had eroded from lack of care. This place had been abandoned for a long time. Ichigo took one step in. Did this place have anything to do with the strange guy he and Luffy had encountered earlier? He took another step. This probably wasn't a smart idea. He continued further into the mountain, ears listening, he could hear something. Whispers. It soon became clear, however, that the whispering wasn't coming from within the mountain, but his own mind. The uncanny voice in the depths of his psyche was louder here, more so than anywhere else. Ichigo stopped walking immediately as a pounding headache suddenly pulsed up and down his skull. A loud rumbling came from within the earth. It sounded like a scream, though whether it was from inside the mountain or his mind, he could not tell. He quickly exited the mountain, stumbling outside, the voice fading as he did so. Panting outside the lavish entryway, the voice inside his mind was now completely silent. He took a few minutes to collect himself, the absence of Zangetsu all too apparent. If he could just get his word back, last time it was this bad had been back during Shangpaio. Ichigo looked up at the sky, eyes on the full moon. It had been a full moon back then as well, was this coincidence? A few moments later and he realized that laying down at an entrance like this wasn't a good move. He shakily climbed to his feet, keeping the location of the mountain entrance in mind as he went. He would make sure to mention it to the others later. Robin sat by the light of an adjacent crack in the earth as Frankie kept watch nearby. Through all her reading over the past half hour, she'd discovered no more information that would tell them about the island's occupants, or much of what had transpired since the first few months of the island's troubles. Eventually, her flicking through the journal's second half arrived at the close. This was it. The final page. Would there be any proper conclusion? Or would it dissolve? Robin read on. Over these past few days, a number of our Shrieker test subjects have suggested to us a harsh reality. At first we thought it may have been a mere coincidence. Yet time after time, we get the same result. These creatures, the Shriekers, are our own. Taken aback, Robin read and reread the last line to assure she hadn't misinterpreted. Then she continued. I don't know what or where the others came from, the specters, the chimeras or the rest, but the Shriekers were once our kinsmen and others like us. A few of the specimens we've discovered seem to once have been some of those who died in the mountain back when all these troubles began, as well as some of those who succumbed to the sickness. Others were taken. The old man was right. We never should have drilled into the backworlds and unleashed the wrath of Dusament. This is our fate and there is nothing we can do. The government has long since ignored our pleas for help. They have turned blind to our very existence, forgotten us. That is our curse. Robin's eyes lingered on the final line of the journal, in which the author, for the first and only time, addressed his potential readers. If you are reading this now, it is likely myself and my comrades are deceased, and I can't imagine the type of misfortune that brought you to these cursed shores. For that, I am sorry. As I depart from this journal, I tell you that my name is Ambrose Wishram, and on this Isle of the Forgotten, our dead never sleep and instead roam the eternal night. Chapter 33. The Only Way Out. Ichigo paced himself at a jog along the curve of the mountain. His encounter at the mountain's opening a while earlier still resounded crisp in his memory, although he'd recovered all of his strength. The nagging suspicion that there was something wrong with this place, something deeper rooted than the obvious surface-level unease, was now more apparent than ever. What had all this meant? Why was his hollow acting up in certain places? It had been doing that more often upon the loss of Zangetsu, but here on this island it felt more powerful. Something in the atmosphere was affecting him, tempting the hollow to emerge. But he wouldn't let that happen, as long as he could help it. Right now, there were more pressing matters to be concerned with. The mountain aside, he had no idea of the island's geographical layout, let alone of his or the other's current location on it. For all he knew, he could be meters or miles from whoever was nearest. He squinted his eyes as he peered through the thick snowfall. The moonlight reflected off the cliff face, bouncing from the snow and providing enough light to guide him along. He continued onwards for some time, before movement in the distance caught his eye. Assuming Shrieker or likewise entity, Ichigo prepared for possible confrontation. He peered through the soft mist, eyes narrowed as he tried to decipher the source of movement. His eyes widened once it was pinpointed, and he found himself smiling in relief. "Oi! Zoro!" he called, waving an arm to catch the attention of the green-haired swordsman, positioned outside a cave, over here. To your left. Other left. Quote. A moment later, the swordsman located him. "Don't yell, you idiot!" he hollered over. His counterproductive order was unnoticed by Ichigo as he joined him outside the cave. "You and the others didn't make it back to the ship," he said. "Do you know what happened?" Quote. "Chopper and I found Usopp earlier on and he filled us in," Zoro said, glancing out at the wilderness around them. "But then we were separated from him again. We were separated from Nami and the cook earlier as well, but managed to find Sanji." Nami's still out there, but with any luck she will have found Usopp or some of the others. Let's go inside, I think Chopper will want to see you. He followed Zoro into the cave, where he discovered Chopper and Sanji. After finally settling down beside a hot spot, and being checked over not once, but twice by Chopper for injuries, Ichigo continued his discussion with Zoro. Luffy and I were separated, he recounted, glancing down. I have no idea where he is now, sorry. Luffy can look after himself, Zoro said, he'll be fine. They all will be. Ichigo couldn't help but notice the very slight unease in the swordsman's eyes. It was almost as though he'd said that to reassure himself. No matter what, however, Ichigo knew Zoro had faith in his captain's abilities. He glanced over to the corner, where Sanji lay resting. A spiral of bandages wound up his leg, as well as around his midsection and shoulder. He looked pale, but the rise and fall of his chest showed that he was breathing and otherwise healthy. What happened to him? Ichigo decided to ask. Idiot took on an entire colony, Zoro replied. Colony? Ichigo questioned. You would have seen some of those monsters while you were out there, Zoro said as an answer. Yeah, what's up with them? Quote. Who knows? So Sanji fought an entire colony? Quote. That's what I said. He was in pretty bad condition earlier, but he's improving, Chopper said. He'll be up in a few hours. And annoying as always, Zoro added, glancing again to the cave's exit. Anyway, we need to see if we can find any sign of Nami. Sanji says he sent her down the mountain in a cable cart. If we follow the line down, we may be able to find her. Alright, Ichigo said with a nod, getting to his feet. He knew it best he accompany the swordsman if only to assist in the much-needed navigational guidance, though of course finding Nami, or any of the others, would be their top priority. You gonna be alright here, Chopper? Quote. Yes, the doctor confirmed, I think this cave is a safe place. It smells better than out there. Okay, if you say so, Ichigo smiled and bade a short farewell, catching Zoro muttering to Chopper to look after the idiot, as he exited the cave, back out into the cold air. He and Zoro walked beside one another in silence for a few minutes, both wary of their surroundings, before reaching that must have been the overhead cable cart track. Zoro, can I ask you something? Ichigo began after a few moments. Go ahead, the swordsman responded. Well, you saw what happened to me back in Atlantica, right? It was the first time he'd confronted the swordsman on the topic. How he would take it, Ichigo was unsure. Zoro grunted an affirmative response. Obviously it was something that had been playing on his mind as well, though he hadn't really had the chance to confront the Shinigami about it. You remember how the hollow came out? Quote. Yeah, Zoro replied, what about it? Quote. Well, Ichigo began, it's this island. Certain parts of it, it feels like the hollow is going to take over, and suddenly. Zoro frowned, but nodded slightly. And how does it feel now? Quote. No different from usual at the moment, Ichigo responded, but I don't know how long it will stay like this. At any moment, it could change, and if I lose control around the others, well, if anyone can stop me, I trust you or Luffy to do it. But seeing as you were the one who saw it happen at Atlantica, maybe there's something more you could do. It's not fair that you've all had to go through this because of me. Don't say crap like that, Zoro said, you've come this far, there's only one more glade after this. Our captain decided he wanted to help you, so that's what we're going to do." With that final sentence it seemed the discussion was over, and Ichigo chose not to push it any further. About 20 minutes later, they found the cable cart Sanji had talked about at the bottom of the mountain. A broken window and the glass in the snow below it suggested it had been broken out of, and the absence of Nami further proved this. "She's gone," Ichigo observed. Zoro glanced inside the empty compartment and then walked around it, searching for any other evidence. But all had been covered by the wind and snow. No shit. Luffy opened his eyes, the throbbing in his shoulder now dull. He shifted himself into a sitting position, his good arm reaching up to his injury. How long had he been sleeping here? Using the nearby tree trunk for support, he hefted himself to his feet and took a moment to regain his bearings. Once his strength returned, he set out at a steady walking pace along the snow, powdery against his sandaled feet. After only a few moments he came to a stop yet again, groaning, his hand resting on his churning stomach. "Meat," he rasped. The mist around him was fairly light and was no hindrance to his vision. He chose to press onwards, no progress would come from just standing there with his stomach rumbling. After only a few minutes, his ears picked up the sound of a twig snapping somewhere off to his right. He wasn't alone. Cautiously, Luffy stepped into the shadow of a cluster of trees. He clenched his knuckles into a fist, ready to strike should the need for combat arise. The sound came again. Whatever it was, Luffy could tell it was very close by, but his haki felt muted and weak. He kept his hand balled into a fist, knowing that it just might be his only weapon for survival. Quietly, he stood firmly against a tree and prepared, before the footsteps came to a sudden halt. This could only mean one thing: his company was also aware of his presence. He would have to act now. Luffy jumped out from behind the tree and punched out at the other presence. His fist connected with the face of the unknown pursuer, sending them flying through the air and landing in a heap. Luffy caught his breath for a moment, the use of sudden movements still hindering to him. He then straightened up and quickly ran for the place his target had landed. Instead of coming across one of the island's weird creatures, however, he came across one of his own. "Huh. Usopp." Quote. Luffy saw his own relief reflected in the eyes of his friend. "Luffy, you jackass." Usopp stammered, massaging his head, "I'm so glad you're okay." "Are you okay?" Quote. "I feel better," Luffy affirmed, offering Usopp a hand up, "but I'm hungry." Accepting the aid, the sniper was pulled to his feet. "I'm glad you're okay," Usopp repeated, offering a one-armed hug, which Luffy accepted and returned, "Even if you punched me, you crazy bastard." Luffy laughed, "Sorry about that, Usopp." Already, being with one of his nakama was giving him more strength. "Do you know where any of the others are?" Quote. "Not right now, but I was with Zoro and Chopper before getting lost." "Yeah, Ichigo and I got separated a while ago," Luffy said, looking back the way he'd come. "There was some weird Asen who caused a storm, made us lose each other." "Nothing like that happened to us," Usopp said, "just a bunch of those creepy monsters. If we run into any of them, we run." "Okay, but I'll also send a few flying with my punch. If you need to." Now, Usopp glanced down the slope of Dusamet. "I was heading down the mountain. I think we could find Sunny or the others down there." "It's a long way down," Luffy said, squinting down the slope. Due to the mist and darkness, the base of the mountain was concealed from sight. We should see how fast we can get to the bottom. It might be fun. And you know what? We'll get down faster if we have a sled, Usopp grinned. A smile spread across Luffy's features. Let's make one. Over the next few minutes, the two plied a sizable amount of bark from the tree and smoothed it out. Usopp had happened to have a small amount of rope on hand, which he figured could be used for steering. Once the makeshift sled was constructed, the two clambered aboard. Luffy, seated at the front, took hold of the rope reins. "We're just going down the hill, right?" Quote. "Yes," Usopp replied, "don't crash into anything." Luffy grinned, and with a gentle push, he and Usopp were rocketing down the mountain. The wind whipped cold and fresh in his face and through his hair, giving a similar sensation to a coup de burst aboard the Thousand Sunny. Luffy whooped in delight, the rush of air catching in his rubber cheeks, fanning them outwards. Right now he felt full of life, so different from the lethargic weight that had been pressing on him over the past few days. He laughed loud and joyously as they flew over a bump, becoming airborne for a number of seconds. Usopp seemed to be enjoying himself too, but expressed it in a different way, one that involved clinging onto his captain for dear life and screaming loudly about being too young to die. Gradually, the slope eased in steepness, coming to a flat. Luffy wanted to head further down the mountain, but Usopp's shaking arms steadied enough to take hold of the reins and veer them to a stop. "That's far enough for now," the sniper said, "let's search along here for a while." The terrain was slightly different on this part of the mountain. As they'd slid to a stop, they'd traversed the mountain diagonally, and now the mountain slope beside them was extra steep and clear of trees for the most part. The few trees within the area seemed to have been flattened by some kind of force. What could have caused that? Exclamation mark. Usopp shuddered. "No idea," Luffy shrugged. "I hope we don't meet it," Usopp said. "Have you been to this part of the island?" Quote. "Nope." Quote. "Neither. If we see anything, we run." "All right." Quote. "Yosh," Luffy nodded, immediately standing to his feet, "let's find the others." Quote. However, the sudden vertigo and dulling adrenaline rush caused his shoulder wound to ache sharply. He winced, hand gripping the wound as he returned to his knees. His insides clenched as the contents of his empty stomach came to surface, splattering across the pure whiteness of the snow. "Oi, Luffy!" Usopp panicked, crouching down beside him. "Take it easy." Quote. Luffy nodded, but heaved once again. Usopp proceeded to rub soothing circles into his back until the ordeal was over. Luffy leant against his friend to catch his breath. "This sucks," he groaned. "It's so cold out here, but you're burning up," Usopp noted, feeling Luffy's forehead with the back of his hand. "It's all right, I'm feeling better again," Luffy said, standing to his feet with slower momentum. "I just need some meat." Usopp stood with him, and gripping his upper arm reassuringly. "That might be true, but you're not fully recovered yet," he explained. "Do what you can, but rely on me for now, alright?" Quote. Luffy smiled. "I can always rely on you, Usopp. You should really still be in bed, idiot. Come on, let's search so we can use the sled again." Quote. Having gathered every trace of courage in her possession, Nami chose to waste no time. The Shrieker's settlement some way ahead of her, which appeared to be the ruins of what was once a town center or large fort under closer inspection, seemed somewhat quiet, and she did not want to wait until it became more active. "Mirage Tempo," she whispered, glazing the Climatact across her body and disappearing from view. Then, stealthily as her cat burglar alias would suggest, she crept toward the lights of the ruined fortress, gradually coming closer. 20 meters. 10 meters. 5. Nami glanced down to assure her invisibility was still in place. She then clambered over the rubble of a fallen wall and into the settlement, into what otherwise would have been plain sight of the creatures. No sooner had she stepped into her enemy's territory, she involuntarily recoiled. The stench was almost unbearable, the air thick with rot and decay. "I can't waste time here," she mentally told herself after a few moments, though slipped part of her jacket over her face to lessen the impact of the foul smell. Nami grimaced and silently edged her way further into the fortress-like town, soon walking in amongst an array of shriekers. They made no acknowledgement of her presence, just as she'd intended. Nami silently exhaled and allowed herself to relax, if only slightly. Nimbly, she made her way further in, careful not to brush any of the shriekers as she passed or disturb anything. A map, she thought to herself, anything. Surrounded like this, she felt so exposed. She could hear them. All around her, the snarling noises of countless shriekers passing one another. Close up like this with no need to fight them off, she could see the creatures in their proper entirety. Their feet were large and taloned, their hands equally large and clawed. Their skin seemed a gluggy, gray color and didn't reflect the moonlight at all. The shorter ones stood at about half a head taller than her, the taller ones easily close to 2.5 meters. Some of them were feasting on what appeared to be a large carcass of some sort. Whatever it was seemed to be in a state of decay. Nami refrained from gagging. That must have been the awful reek she'd encountered upon stepping into the settlement. One of them, at least. As she traveled further into the fortress, she saw many different things, none of which she was looking for, nor wanted any dealing with. What may have once been a human skin lay splayed across a wall, dark patches of dried blood patterning its surface. Rusted hooks aligned the walls, many featuring decayed body parts. Butcher-like tools littered the ground beneath, and Nami chose to observe no further and concentrate on the task at hand. She fleetingly evaded direct contact with the shriekers. Some were so close, she could hear their breaths, ragged and drawn out as they passed. Nami held her own as she slowly eased around them. For a moment, she could have sworn she'd locked eye contact with one, but it moved on and she continued, her eyes scanning her surroundings for anything that might aid her. Nami felt herself trembling but pushed onwards, further still into the settlement, her thoughts of her nakama and Sanji's sacrifice helping to ease her fears. If she could just find a map. Loud, heavy breathing caused her to frantically sidestep another particularly close shrieker. As it passed, part of her could have sworn that it had been staring right at her, that her own eyes had met its dark and gaping ones. A quick glance down at herself, however, proved she was still very invisible, and she wrote the encounter off at the creature merely looking through her. But then it happened again. And this time, the creature did not walk away. Its eyes, white and pupil-less on this one, stayed on her, even as it had passed her, and it began to circle around. Shit. Nami glanced around for an exit in the old fortress that would be easy to make for. But she was too far in to get out without detection, though it seemed she had already been found out. She would have to run for it, any plan to find a map scrapped. She would be of best use to her nakama now if she could get out of this situation unscratched. Her breath hitched suddenly when she noticed the creature was not alone in granting her its attention. A harsh reality suddenly dawned. Throughout the entire settlement, right from where she'd entered, all the way to the opposite side where she'd intended to exit. The creatures were silently circling, slowly closing in. And then it occurred to her. Had it not been here and now, she may have laughed at her own stupidity, for the fact of the matter was now obvious as the glowing moonlight against the slate-like sky. She'd used her mirage tempo to erase her visibility, thinking it could keep her safe. But the chilling reality was here plain as the ever-reaching night, and bearing into her soul with its lifeless stare. These creatures relied on senses other than sight. They had played along all this time to lure her into their settlement before making their move. Nami wheeled around, losing count of the now obvious sets of glowing eyes, all focused upon her. All paths to escape were blocked. It was far too late to turn back now. The shriekers advanced upon her thirstily, their rasping vocal noises filling her ears as they came closer. Her actions of rendering herself invisible were no different to walking onto the enemy's territory with no cover and waving a set of flares. They'd pretended not to notice her as they'd silently surrounded. In her efforts to go unnoticed, she'd walked right into their trap. Chapter 34. Lesson 3. Do not forget. They'd been traveling for almost another hour by the time they settled on using the sled again. There appeared to be nothing of use on the flat. Usopp figured it a safe space, yet with no satisfactory shelter, the cold posed danger on its own. Heading down the mountain was their goal anyway, even if it was little by little. It seemed a very high mountain, and any progress, even if small, was still progress. That was the optimistic side of him talking, of course. Luffy's cries of glee seemed to match his own of terror as they descended the slope once more. Not so fast. He yelled as they zipped down the mountain, continuously gaining speed and becoming airborne at irregular intervals. Slower. Slow down. Quote. At the very least, Luffy's spirits seemed to soar with the sled, and it was definitely better than he'd felt over the past few days, even given their situation. He hadn't forgotten about it, of course, but like all things, enjoying themselves and having fun where they could made it easier. Finally, they came to another flat, about 5 meters wide before the slope steepened once again. But this would do for now. Usopp peered up the mountain in mild concern and Luffy followed his line of sight. It was just the same as before. It had been the same all the way down, a lack of trees, or the occasional flattened husk of one. I wonder why there are no trees growing in this area, Usopp voiced for a second time. He'd said something about it earlier as well, but Luffy hadn't been paying attention. It wasn't really something he was concerned with. Who cares? Luffy responded with a wide grin. No trees means it's easier to go down the mountain real fast. Usopp side-eyed him with a slight frown. And that's a good thing? Quote. I think it is. Luffy chirped in response. It's not like there's anything for us to crash into, if that's what you're worried about. Oh, other than those fire holes, of course, but we can go over those, easy. Quote. The lack of trees certainly made it easier to zip down the mountain at high speeds, and if that wasn't a plus, Luffy didn't know what was. At any rate, there were other things to be concerned about aside the lack of vegetation on this side of the mountain. Usopp was aware of this, of course. They both were. Alright, Usopp said, but we'll go along here for a while before we use the sled again, right? Quote. Right. And so they continued for a little while, occasional friendly banter between them making the trip less tedious. But soon the mist was closing in around them again. Luffy let his laughter from Usopp's latest joke die down a little and brought up his guard. They still needed to be careful. Especially himself given his condition, even if he wouldn't admit it out loud. As the fog crept in heavier still, Usopp didn't even need to be told. Luffy noticed him quivering slightly where he stood, but he otherwise betrayed no sound. With no trees around, there were no leaves to crunch, no twigs to snap, no sounds of the sort that could help confirm extra presences. But the light from a nearby pit, as it glowed in the deepening fog, cast shadows across the white slate of landscape, profiles that were not their own. Without even realizing it, both Luffy and Usopp had drawn to a stop. Somehow, they'd ended up positioning themselves back to back, and in spoken agreement between the two of them that this was the position they'd be needing most for what was undoubtedly coming. A vocal sound, non-human, vertebrated from the mist nearby, Usopp silencing it with a projectile before it had time to repeat itself. But even then, they did not slacken their stances. This battle was not over. There would be more. There were always more. "Luffy, over there!" Usopp shouted. Luffy turned, noting one of the shrieking creatures coming up through the fog on his left. A clear hammering kick to its gut sent it sprawling several meters, a dusting of snow flicking up before it fell into one of the island's many crevices. He retracted his leg and grimaced slightly. Stretching even smaller distances still caused discomfort. If only getting rid of them all was that simple. The rasping cries and shrieks of the attacking creatures filled his ears for the next several minutes. But he would keep fighting, he and Usopp both. A new chill filtered into the surrounding atmosphere once the shriekers began their retreat. A new enemy had appeared. "Not these guys," Usopp muttered from behind him. Luffy tilted his head in vague confusion as an apparition flickered amongst the few enemies still facing them. Ghosts? He realized he'd encountered them earlier, after being separated from Ichigo and before joining Usopp. Usopp retrieved a handful of ammo from his bag. Fire Bird Star. The fiery projectile worked well, causing numerous of the growing number of specters to disperse. However, this was met by a new problem. "Crap. I don't have much ammo left," Usopp cursed. "It's all right," Luffy said, "I can take care of this." Another dozen of the specters began encircling them just as the last of Usopp's Firebird depleted. "Cut that out." The wave of Conqueror's haki passed over his friend, and out to the specters. It seemed to do the job. The specters fled, seemingly dissolving into the night as they went. "Are they gone?" Luffy asked after a few peaceful moments. "Yeah. Good." He felt his knees buckle, but Usopp grabbed his arm, swinging it over his shoulder. "Nice work, Luffy," he said. Luffy grinned in response. "Don't mention it." Quote. You can turn your haki off now though." "Huh? I have, Usopp." "What's with all that rumbling then?" Quote. It then occurred to Luffy that there was indeed some sort of rumbling, and it wasn't coming from himself. Not even his stomach, which, whilst it was rumbling, was not the cause of the tremor in the ground around them. In the moonlight, Usopp's skin paled to the color of the snow and cinders around them. "Don't you hear that?" he asked quietly. Luffy strained his ears. At first he might have thought it to be his own heartbeat, but it didn't take much to realize that was not the case. It was audible now, and growing louder by the second. A heavy, rushing, tumbling sound, coming from up the mountain like an angry deity cursing the island beneath it. Like a distant groaning of thunder, it grew louder and more acute before it could reach a closer field of viewing. "We need to get out of here," Usopp stated. Luffy was about to respond when a massive wall of snow appeared from somewhere above them, hurtling down the mountain at an impressive speed. There was no need, nor time, to voice his agreement. "Avalanche!" Usopp hollered. He hastily pulled Luffy the few meters to the next slope, before sitting them both down onto the sled. This time, unlike before, keen to go at a fast speed. "Go go go!" Quote. Using their combined leg strength, the two of them pushed themselves down the icy slope, with no care for speed. It made more sense now, the lack of trees on this part of the mountain. It, unlike the rest of the island, had been free of forest, though had sported the occasional flattened tree. Avalanches must have been a common occurrence. "Faster, faster, faster!" Usopp chanted, a vast contrast to his earlier pleads. But the wall of white behind them was gaining fast, and their little strip of wood had no hope of outlasting the ferocity of the uncaring mountainside. "Damn it," Luffy heard Usopp curse, before they were both consumed in a tsunami-like reach, their sled splintering beneath them. Usopp had never actually wondered what it would be like to be placed in a washing machine full of ice on full ball. But if he ever did, he would envision something a lot similar to what he was now experiencing. The wave of snow was something a lot like water. Technically it was frozen water. He'd been dumped by waves whilst playing in the surf his fair share of times, and the sensation was something similar. Except this was more prolonged. This was colder, darker, and far more disconcerting. After what felt like an age, the tumbling finally ceased. It was as though they'd been digested and devoured by a raging and uncaring snow spirit, to be spat out the other end in a disorientating icy jumble. His head was spinning. Was it over? Which was his up? Survive. That was Usopp's first instinct, make sure we both survive. He had no idea how much snow they were buried beneath, but it felt heavy. He had a firm arm around Luffy. The convenience they had not been separated a small comfort. It didn't change the fact, however, that they'd just been buried by an avalanche, which by primary nature was not a good thing. Heck, being on this island was not a good thing to begin with, though they were well past the point of establishing that. Luffy was right beside him, at least. But they certainly couldn't stay here. Air. They needed an air pocket at the very least. The snow around them had not yet set. Usopp could shift his free arm easily enough to burrow some breathing space around himself and Luffy. But it was to almost no avail. Movement would cause more snow to shift into the vacant space. This proved a dilemma. In order to breathe, they had to remain still. In order to escape, they had to move. Moreover, they had to warm up. It wouldn't do if they were frozen beneath all this. They had to get to the surface. But, which way was that? Usopp has the sneaking suspicion that it was in the direction of his feet, the avalanche having flipped him around so many times before disposing him the wrong way up. Damn it, if only he could get a proper hold on things. Sounds came from up above them. Voices. Shit. Something's here. Digging sounds came from what Usopp presumed was the up direction. The pressure seemed less after only a few moments. Before he could do anything, Luffy was jerked from his grip, his friend disappearing into the world above. Panicking, he opened his mouth to call his captain's name, only for the icy particles around him to pour in, still loose and uncompressed all round him. At this rate, if he tried to dig himself out, he was only going to be buried deeper. But he needed to try, for Luffy. What had dug him out anyway? Usopp's mind scanned over all the creatures he'd encountered thus far before a pair of large hands found his body, and he too was hefted to the surface. The fresh night air was a welcome asset to his lungs, at least. Usopp spluttered, breathing deeply, but was more concerned by the situation at hand. He quickly reached for his kabuto, safely secured on his back the whole time, whilst noting that whoever or whatever had pulled them out wasn't attacking, not now at least. He had to take the chance. He rummaged his bag immediately, but his hands found only snow in place of ammo. Apparently he couldn't hold on to anything in that jumbling void. "Whoa, bro. Relax," a familiar voice ushered him before he could resort to any backup plan. "You okay, bro?" Quote. "Huh? Frankie?" He was still in the cyborg's hold, having been pulled up from the ground by him, not unlike a weed. "Frankie. Boy, am I glad to see you. Luffy and I were. Wait, Luffy is. It's alright, we've got you both," Frankie informed him. Usopp finally took a moment to observe his surroundings, to find Robin standing nearby, her arms folded around a shivering Luffy. "You guys are going to be super okay," Frankie assured with a grin. "Good run, Usopp," Luffy sniffed with a grin, raising a trembling thumbs up. Unbelievable. Literally buried in an avalanche and still had good spirits about him. His captain never failed to amaze. "We're not dead," Usopp exhaled, before laughing. "Just as I intended." Quote. "Of course," Frankie commented offhandedly. "Well, you guys were pretty super back there. You could see us?" Quote. "Only just," Robin contributed. "Had it been much foggier, Frankie may not have spotted you at all." "Super night vision," Frankie answered. "Awesome," Luffy exclaimed, thought with notably less energy than usual as he settled into Robin's hold. "You made plenty of noise, however," Robin said. "I thought you were being killed." "We were, almost," Usopp spluttered in response, suddenly realizing just how cold he was himself. See, can we move closer to one of those fire craters? I could still be killed from the cold." Quote. "We can move a little closer to one," Robin said, before looking to Frankie, "but then we should hurry." He nodded in response. "Hurry for what?" Usopp asked. "Robin and I have found the Sunny," Frankie reported. "Now we just need to reclaim it." Nami gritted her teeth as her grip over the Climatak tightened. Not that it would help her out any in a situation like this. In the darkness, numerous sets of glowing, menacing eyes peered at her, a ravaging thirst and hunger present in each. And there were so many. I'm going to get out of here," Nami rationalized with herself as calmly as possible, which meant she was trembling all over. There was no visible opening in the haphazard circle they'd ensnared her in, their grunts and growls a constant humming in the night, like a melodyless symphony edging towards its climax. Nami did not want them to reach it. It was not long before they attacked, seemingly all at once. Nami was surprised at just how ready she was. "Thunderbolt tempo," she shouted, summoning a quick thunderstorm and smiting a number of her challengers where they stood. If she could just get in a few more good strikes like that one, there'll be an end to them. However, the relieving thought had come too soon. A high-pitched whizzing sound protruded the air, and before Nami could react, a sharp prick of pain embedded the small of her back through her coat. It was just like the one they'd gotten Sanji with earlier. Swearing under her breath, she removed it immediately, focusing on the imminent dangers at hand. Her coat was thick, the dart only managing to puncture the top layer of skin. Not enough to affect her entirely, but her movements had become sluggish all the same. A sudden tug caught her off guard and her Climatak toppled to the ground, out of her reach. In her peripheral vision, she saw the Shrieker launch just a moment too late. Shit. The body collided into her own, sending her skidding across the icy ground and narrowly missing a crevice. The shrieker was upon her before she could do any more, its awful body grabbing at her arms in attempt to further disable her. She rolled, desperately grasping to gain upper hand over the monster. This one was not much bigger than her, thankfully. If it were one of the larger ones, things would prove more difficult. And they would if she didn't defeat this one in time. She could hear the growls and snarls of others nearby, larger than the one she was fending off presently. The crevice beside her meant an instant, fiery death. Whilst there was still hope and whilst her nakama were still out there somewhere, Nami would not resort to that. And if those nakama had taught her anything, it was that there was always hope. The muscles in her arms burned as she pushed the mass off herself, and it toppled into the crevice below, disappearing with a satisfying gurgle and hiss of flames. She launched herself for her climb attack just as the shrieker had done her. She was so close, just inches away from grabbing her staff and delivering the shriekers the lightning show of their lives. All she would need was half a second and a large gnarled hand grabbed her entirely by the upper right arm. Another took her legs, bowling them out from beneath her entirely. The distance between herself and the climb attack suddenly grew until there was no hope of reaching it. Nami found herself thrashing, but to no avail. She'd been completely overpowered and they were taking her. Panic like no other bubbled from deep within her. What were they doing? Where would they take her? They drew to a stop after only a few moments, on the edge of a frozen-over lake. Nami gasped. On the rock beside her was a long-dead corpse, preserved by the cold. It appeared to have been partially dismembered. So this was what became of those poor souls who ventured to this part of the forgotten glade. Nami's breath hitched as her hands were bound to a likewise stone with use of a painfully barbed wire and knew that whatever process transpired for that corpse was about to begin for her. However, before they could continue, something odd happened. An eerie silence bestilled the creatures as their awful vocal sounds suddenly quietened. Nami soon realized that their attention was no longer on her, but rather another entity out there in the mist, indistinguishable from the fog. And then, as quickly as they silenced, they seemed to tense up. Nami found it strange that panic was such a universal emotion, even amongst monsters such as these. Seemingly forgetting her, the shriekers fled. And Nami found panic of her own. She'd only encountered one thing that had made the shriekers act like that. And she never wanted to meet it again. Struggling against her confinements, she noticed the towering figure in question slowly loom into view just on the edge of her scope of vision. Whether or not the figure was totally silent or made noise as its feet glided over the ice of the embankment, Nami was unsure. The sound of her own blood pumping as her heart raced was the only thing she could hear as she struggled. An entity such as this, which could send ferocious creatures such as the shriekers into such fear, was something she barely wanted to imagine, let alone encounter. After what felt like an age, her trembling hands broke through the bonds. She paid no mind to the way the barbed wire cut through her flesh. She's deal with it later. With only 2 steps, she found herself flat on the ground. Damn it, not now. Her adrenaline would keep her going long enough, she figured. As swiftly as she could, she got to her feet and ran, her mind only focusing and hanging on to the tiny fact that she had to get away. But she knew her pace was slow, and that whatever had chased the shriekers away was quickly catching up. She knew she was growing tired and that it could see her. She could feel its gaze on her, the target of its advancing trajectory. It was just like a nightmare and she couldn't escape. Before long, a hand ensnared her by the upper arm, and Nami finally found voice enough to scream, as if such a thing would frighten it off. She clenched her eyes shut and tried to force herself out of its vice-like grip. It didn't work, despite her struggles. But something was different. The grip was strong, there was no doubt about that. But unlike the shriekers, it wasn't hostile. It was gentle. Nami opened her eyes, her vision finally swimming back into focus. She blinked, her breathing steadying. Brook? Quote. Relief settled in the skeleton's lidless eyes. Yes, Nami-san, he answered, the sound of his voice helping to soothe her all the more. It's me. Are you alright? Quote. Nami nodded, her mind replayed the events as she straightened up, trembling and trying to make sense of what had just happened. She began, an intense relief washed over her and she suddenly found herself leaning into the warmth, or lack thereof, of her nakama, trying to hold back tears of that relief as Brook linked a gentle arm around her in return, smoothing out her hair. Brook, those monsters, Sanji-kun and I got separated. I can't find any of the others, It's alright, Nami-san, Brook said. You've been through a lot in a short amount of time, I presume. But don't worry yourself any further. It will be alright. We'll find Sanji-san and the others, you'll see. Nami sniffed and nodded, pulling back as Brook guided her safely out of the clearing whilst explaining something about the creatures fearing him. Nami didn't hear much of it, her drowsiness from the battle starting to settle in. With Brook's hand over her shoulder again, she figured he was guiding her to someplace to rest for now. It would be a little while before they saw the others, it seems. But it was okay. Nami let her mind wander as she felt herself relax all the more, trusting herself to the song that she knew so well. Ellipsis. A few hours passed, by which Luffy recovered most of his strength. The prospect that reclaiming the Sunny would mean access to meat seemed to help, and Usopp had found himself warm to the point he was satisfied he would not be turning into a human icicle. He also found himself positioned within the confines of an on-the-spot cannon Frankie had miraculously crafted from nearby ruins. The Sunny is just over that ridge, Frankie reported, but so is some sort of colony of those creatures. It's in their territory, and I don't think we can just walk in and ask for it back. Do you all understand the plan? Quote. Yes, Luffy said right away, earning questionable glances from his crewmates. Why do I have the crap job? Usopp asked, deflated. You're most suited for it, Robin assured, and don't worry. We'll make sure you're not killed horrifically. I'd rather not be killed in any way, Usopp replied, retreating further into the cannon before Frankie spoke again. Are you ready to fly, Usopp? Quote. Usopp gulped, adjusting his goggles over his eyes. He would be needing them. Do I have to answer that? Quote. Good point. Do us proud. On Frankie's action, the cannon went off. And Usopp flew. Unfortunately, this part is over. I hope you enjoyed it. My apologies for all those quotes. Please have a good morning, afternoon, evening or night. See you next time, faves.